Done a breakdown video in a very long time, so we're going to be doing one. This is from the Joint House Intelligence Committee um, regarding the 9/11 attacks. And there, Jay Rockefeller, panelist, interviews Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Armitage. Let's see what they have to say.
I don't know. Thank you, Mr. Wolfowitz and Mr. Armitage. Excellent statements. We appreciate the significant contribution that you have and are making to our nation's security. I would like to call upon Senator Rockefeller for the first round of questions. Senator Rockefeller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Armitage and Secretary Wolfowitz, for being here. Let me just state at the beginning what Eleanor Hill said yesterday, and that is it was not our intelligence community, it was not the FBI, it was not anybody else that did the killing at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania, other than the terrorists. That rules.
Well, what's not known to what's not known to the committees themselves was that there was actionable intelligence about additional hijacked flights, especially in Boston. Now, no one covers this. The only people I've ever known to cover this was Paul Thompson, and then, of course, our fellow 9/11 researcher, DJ Thermodetonator. Nobody talks about this issue. It wasn't just 19. It was a lot more. Zacarias Moussaoui was selected to be initially within the first team, but then he was, according to Moussaoui himself, remember, he wasn't tortured. He says that he was selected for the second wave of attacks. And what was going on September 13th, 14th, when they opened up the airports? They arrested over, 50 Arabs who were boarding planes with fictitious names, one even dressed as a pilot who was a bin Laden family member. Coincidence?
Having said that, I'd like to talk a little bit about perceived threats and ask some questions. According to the Department of State publication of Patterns of Global Terrorism, there were 274 international terrorist attacks in 1998 alone, reflecting that the number of attacks, in fact, had been decreasing and were, in fact, at their lowest point since 1971. If we measure the threat of terrorism by the number of Americans killed, and of course, even one death is too much. If we include the attacks on our African embassies, 12 U.S. citizens died in 1998, 54 were killed in the preceding 5 years. In 1999, 5 more Americans died. In 2000, another 19 died, 17 on the USS Cole. These numbers are both tragic, but they show a fairly persistent pattern over the past decade. Even with this consistent pattern of activity, George Tenet, who by most Americans I think is considered to be the person who runs intelligence in this country. We know that not to be true, and I'm going to discuss that. But, you know, the director of Central Intelligence is kind of evokes an image of real control. He was concerned enough, as both of you mentioned, and particularly Secretary Wolfowitz, to mention in 1998 and tell his deputies, and then it was broadly disseminated within the intelligence community. It doesn't say beyond that in our report, that we are at war with al-Qaeda. So my first question is, what did you think that meant, either both of you? What did you think that meant, and what should have happened at that point in your judgment? The reason I asked that question, Secretary Wolfowitz, you talk a lot about things that must happen, things that cannot happen. Again, we must make.
Think about this for a second. The Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI, declared an act of war against an ideological opponent in al-Qaeda. Usually an act of war would be given by the United States president. But in this context, it was given by the Director of Central Intelligence. Now, I've never heard in my life anybody from the intelligence community or in Congress declare an act of war against an ideological opponent or an ideology. This is the closest we've ever come.
sure that such and such doesn't happen again. But specifically, what did that mean, we are at war, to you as you came into office? And what should have happened at that point in your judgment?
Want to go first?
Let me go first, then Secretary Armitage can add. I think it means that you plan for war. And in fact, over the course of, from the time Secretary Armitage was sworn in, which I think was late March of 2001, which was when we finally had 2 deputies and could have a deputies committee. In fact, prior to that, I believe even National Security Advisor Dr. Rice had tasked her staff to begin preparing options for what this would mean. And as you start to look at it, you realize that war against al-Qaeda is something different from going after individual acts of terrorism or retaliating against individual acts of terrorism, that it really does involve all the elements of national power, that it's not just something for the intelligence community alone, that in fact you can't go to war against al-Qaeda without recognizing the role that the government of Afghanistan is playing. You can't go after the government of Afghanistan without recognizing the problems in your relationship, particularly with Pakistan, but with other neighboring countries. And you can't get serious about this without looking at military options. And when you start to look at military options, you have to think about something more than a one-off retaliation for an attack. And that is the process that we're engaged in over the course of basically the summer of 2001. And ironically enough, it led to a Principals Committee meeting in early September before the attacks that produced recommendation that was not far off from what we ultimately implemented after September 11th. Let me emphasize one other point, and that
12
is,
questions in 20 minutes.
Okay, now, look, I got a problem with this. Is because here you have the Director of Central Intelligence engaging in an act of war against al-Qaeda. But yet when the Bush administration comes in the year 2000, basically he ignores Richard Clark, the National Counterterrorism Coordinator, regarding holding meetings with Clark, who was considered the premier expert regarding counterterrorism and the bin Laden problem. The primary threats to the United States, according to the Bush administration, was China, North Korea, but not al-Qaeda. And that's coming from other State Department officials who actually were interviewed by members of the 9/11 Commission regarding this. If al-Qaeda indeed was a threat, and they were, why didn't the State Department give it any validity whatsoever coming from the DCI? Because not all the time do factions of the government agree with one another, believe it or not. You know, I know like there's a lot of fringe conspiracy theorists who like to think that everybody in the government is, you know, they're all in on it. They're all basically agreeing to one another. There may be minor differences, but they're all conspiring all together. That's not necessarily the case. It's much more complex than that. The CIA is a different entity outside of the White House. Allegedly, the White House runs things. They don't. CIA runs a lot of things because they got the information. The White House doesn't. You saw what they did to Kennedy, Clinton. All right. So, yeah, I mean, in this case, the State Department, the Bush White House, and the CIA had vast differences about who is a threat to the national security in the United States.
So
okay,
I need
I
brevity.
stop. Okay.
To the extent possible.
I'll only add that I think our story is pretty good on going after al-Qaeda from April 30th on, after the first deputies meeting. However, where we went wrong, and I think where we made a mistake, was that we didn't have first of all, a necessary baseline from intelligence on the global aspects and global possibilities of al-Qaeda, number one. And number two, although many of us, including members of Congress, were saying the right words, I don't think that we really had made the leap in our mind that we're no longer safe behind these two great oceans. And even though we'd had the World Trade Center attack of 1993.
When you came into office, did you both think / know that we were at war with al-Qaeda?
I was briefed in January and February, leading to my hearings in March for the U.S. Senate. The terms "at war" was, to my knowledge or my remembrance, not used. There was no question, though, that we were in a struggle with al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda was the very first thing that the administration took on at the deputies level.
But you were aware that the DCI thought we were at war?
I was aware of his comments.
Yes. And did the Intelligence community clearly warn you what al-Qaeda was capable of doing and that it sought to carry out a mass casualty on U.S. soil? Did you know that? Had you been informed of that by the intelligence community?
The intelligence community, as I recall, informed me, one, that we might have an explosion in Kenya from an explosive-laden aircraft. I do not specifically remember a mass casualty event. However, there were discussions in INR and the State Department from information gleaned from the intelligence community that there was the possibility of a chem-bio attack. No location, no time, but that was being discussed.
What did you two gentlemen perceive the threat to be?
I, in general, perceive the threat to be at our interest overseas, primarily in the Gulf, some in Southeast Asia, and most definitely in Israel. That's from my point of view in the Department of State.
Yeah, figures.
I would say near term, we perceive the threat to be overseas, as Secretary Armitage says. In the mid to longer term.
By the way, what he meant by Israel, in Israel, he meant the Palestinians. By the way, it just so happened that the first people blamed for 9/11 wasn't bin Laden, it was actually the Palestinians. Remember that phone call that was made to some caller, and it was recorded by the 9/11 operators about they were seeing men in a van, and the woman asked them, what do they look like? Well, they look Palestinian. How the fuck does that even mean? Right? It's like Iraq was blamed for 1993, and then later on 9/11. Where do you think that information came from? Neocons, like Laurie Mallory, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Armitage, Donald Rumsfeld, Douglas Feith, these other ghouls.
We perceive the threat to be mass casualties in the United States as a result of chemical or biological or conceivably nuclear attack. And that's why in the course of developing the Quadrennial Defense Review over the summer of 2001, we identified Homeland Security as the top priority for transformation.
Did you take any steps with respect to reacting to these threats that the Clinton administration had not taken at their point in time? Because the 1998 fatwa, the Tenet warning came out in 98.
We increased in INR the number of analysts. We have 14 in general look at terrorism and crime. We increased the number to 8. It's since been increased after 9/11 to 10. So that's a specific answer.
We undertook a number of steps in our development of the defense program to increase our capability to detect or respond to weapons of mass destruction attacks. And I believe there were a number of classified actions taken by other agencies, specifically against Al-Qaeda.
You can tell us? Unclassified?
No. Not with respect to classified actions. Specifics on what we did with respect to developing our own capabilities to respond, I can give you lots of detail for the record.
Please do that. Who, in fact, is responsible for assessing the risk of terrorist attack in the United States of America? And was any strategic assessment or other kind of assessment done when you came into office, both of you?
I think what you're putting your finger on, I think, to some extent, is that we have certain divisions of responsibility between what the FBI and domestic law enforcement is responsible for and what the CIA is responsible for, and indeed limitations on what the CIA is allowed to do and collect domestically, which I think members of this committee are very familiar with. So there is a problem of where responsibility is assigned. I'm not aware of any specific assessment of what the threat was domestically.
I agree, sir.
All right.
Here you have a history of Arab fundamentalism in the United States, especially from 1983 onward, right? The looming threat that's coming, that was warned by, people within the intelligence community, all ignored. From the 9/3 World Trade Center bombing to the Bajinka plot, to the Millennium Plot, to the East Africa bombings, to USS Cole bombing, then 9/11. And everyone asks, how did this happen? Well, it happens when you have intelligence services that basically have foot soldiers that are trying to do the right thing, and they're ignored by their superiors for whatever reason, right? And then you have officials in the White House that are basically inactive to take measures about strengthening the security in this country about a looming threat overseas. But by the time the threat grows inside the United States, it's too late. You can buy the unstoppable door, but it's not going to stop the problem. It's already in the country. And in a more nefarious term, when you have intelligence services that know that there's a threat inside the United States, a direct threat to its national security, to life and liberty, and don't share that information, don't you think that it's high time that these people are held accountable? If we can't basically solve 9/11 about the specifics, we can get to these people that basically didn't share intelligence that could have stopped the attacks or protected the individuals in the first place, while also using a foreign power in Saudi Arabia. Never mind Israel. It's a whole different animal. But in this context, we have a lot of information at our disposal where we can blame the CIA, the NSA, and Saudi Arabia. And then, to finish it off, Israel. But where do we go first? What issues should be brought up first? That's the thing. Well, there are a couple of issues. We talked about them here on this channel.
Obviously, we'd had the 1993 World Trade Center incident, and there'd been a whole series of other things which Eleanor Hill delineated yesterday. So there were things going on in this country over a long period of time. The question was, were they individually aggregated and taken to a higher level where they reached policymakers and said, oh, this is not just a matter of the international, but this is a matter of domestic. So America's perception of threat as here as opposed to overseas was not, you're saying, fully formed when you gentlemen took office.
I think that's a fair statement, but I'd like to accompany it with the notation and the notice that when Mr. Bush was a candidate, he specifically spoke about Homeland Security, and he was drawing on a report that was actually commissioned by the U.S. Congress, the National Defense Panel report, which spoke about Homeland Security being a new mission area, and the Pentagon is on top of that as far as I can see. And second, that we recognize that we couldn't have a policy, certainly in South Asia, as early and more broadly as early as the end of April, when we had a deputies meeting and made decisions and gave instructions to not just roll back Al Qaeda, but to go after and eliminate them.
Thank you. The intelligence community, this is sort of about what you were talking about, Secretary Wolfowitz, collects, analyzes, and disseminates one kind of intelligence for civilian policymakers, and another and different kind for the defense needs to shape our military forces and plan and execute military operations. Many of our intelligence collection systems used to collect both kinds of intelligence. I mean, there's an overlap. And it is well known. No, in fact, it isn't well known generally out there in the country, but it is a fact that 85% of the money of the budget is within or controlled by the Department of Defense. So it's important to understand the different needs, how they overlap, and how they do not, and what happens when there is a conflict between the civilian policy needs and military needs. And to that, I would just give you something to lop on. If Director Tenet foresaw a requirement to make a change, that he needed to have something happen, but that was not under his budget authority, would he have the ability to go into the Department of Defense and take something that he needed in the way of money? Or is it the unwritten law that the Director of Central Intelligence, thought to be the controller of intelligence by most of our country, in fact usually loses when he goes up against the Secretary of Defense?
I don't think that describes the relationship. In fact, I think Secretary Rumsfeld and Director Tenet have a closer relationship than any previous Secretary of Defense in the DCI, and when these issues have come up, this was true before September 11th. It's doubly or triply true now.
Not interested in personal relationships. I'm interested in the question I asked.
It's not a personal matter. It is a working relationship. It is a professional relationship. They meet regularly. These problems get resolved. We have frequently moved resources to address their needs. But I think a fundamental point, too, here, Senator, related to a lot of these questions, is this is not a game we will ever win on defense. We'll only win it on offense. And I believe that recognition came.
How did that work out? It did in Afghanistan. You spent 20 years there. The Taliban took over with Al-Qaeda in their government, stronger than ever before. How did that work out in Iraq? You actually created the vacuum for the Islamic State in the Levant. How did that work out in Syria? You tried to eliminate Bashar al-Assad, a murderous dictator, by using the very groups of Wahhabi terrorists that were supposedly at war with, using a CIA, Jordanian, Israeli, Saudi Arabian authority figures to help out in this operation called Timber Sycamore. How'd that work out in Libya? By killing Muammar Gaddafi and destroying the Libyan government, which is now mired under a civil war with Al-Qaeda affiliates and the Islamic State fighting for control of northern Libya. How did the attacks, these reactions, affect these countries? And was it for the better? I would say it wasn't. So you could play offense all you want, but when you have madmen like Paul Wolfowitz at the helm, you're going to lose every single time.
Very early in this administration, and the recognition that going on offense was something that would be a very substantial exercise.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary?
Absolutely.
Okay. Under the current structure, I think it's fair to say that the Director of Central Intelligence, thought by the American people to sort of control intelligence, doesn't. And I'm not arguing that point. But I'm raising, I don't think there have been any recent Central Intelligence directors who have really wanted to venture beyond their budget authority. And their budget authority is fundamentally 15% of the intelligence budget. So that it raises all kinds of questions about the relationship between the DCI and the DOD, which you say is very good. And I've been at the meetings when people have had their arms around each other. We're working very well together. But it doesn't seem to work out necessarily to the best coordination of intelligence activities. It seems to me that, in fact, that any DCI lacks that authority, is not necessarily willing to take on a Secretary of Defense who controls budgets and personnel. And if there is any truth in either of your minds in this, Does that, in your judgment, hinder the fight against terrorism?
Of course.
Senator, I don't think it's a matter of taking on the Secretary of Defense. I think there are times when it would be helpful, and this is why we've proposed an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, when the director has a problem or when his subordinates have a problem, to be able to come to somebody below the level of the secretary and get these problems sorted out. When problems are elevated, my experience has been they have been resolved, and I don't think there are basic problems here that flow from some inability of the Director of Central Intelligence to get from the Department of Defense what they need. But a basic point, which I think the American people also expect, is that these vast intelligence resources of ours will be made available to permit our military to win wars when they fight them. And the intelligence resources of the Defense Department have been absolutely critical in this campaign against terrorism.
And I agree with what you've said.
And no, that's not true, because the campaign against terrorism has always been a unmitigated failure due to the fact that we have intelligence from the intelligence community that are not fully actionable. In fact, after 9/11, a lot of the intelligence regarding terrorist activity in certain countries turned out to be even outright false. CIA, anyone? Anyone? So what Wolfowitz saying here is demonstrably false, especially after 9/11.
And I also note that in your testimony you talked about stovepiping, and you talked about the proposed new Secretary for Intelligence. And I'd like to ask your question. How do you think that this is going to help bring clarity, succinctness, precision, sequential accuracy to the variety of 10 or 11 different intelligence agencies which exist, but which have no sort of central command, even though the American people think it's that way? How will this proposed new secretary be able to bring clarity to the process of the gathering, dissemination, assessment, strategic assessment of that intelligence?
I think the key to breaking down stovepipes is to bring them together at levels below the very top level of the government. When the only place they come together is at the cabinet level, then inevitably there are going to be walls and compartments that busy cabinet officers don't have the time to break down. Having an Undersecretary for Intelligence whose sole responsibility is overseeing those agencies and precisely looking at those compartments and stovepipes, I think, is a key to doing it. In the Rumsfeld Commission, looking at the ballistic missile threat, 9 of us working part-time were able to do an enormous amount of breaking down stovepipes, but it requires people who are focused on that issue and not distracted by many other things. That's what an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence will be able to do.
Talking about stovepipes is something that the intelligence community and this committee has done for a very, very long time, and we've seen not much progress. So when you say getting people together at a lower level, I'm pleased to hear that. Could you elaborate a little bit on how you really break down a culture of non-communication, of individual campuses spread around within a 3 to 6 mile radius of Congress, which all have their own cultures, their own memorial gardens, their own cafeterias, their own set of histories? I mean,
You can't. It's impossible, right? So when you have different agencies within who have in mind the national defense in mindset, right? The safety and security of everyday Americans. You have the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, the FBI, right? The major organizations, Homeland Security later, right? Diplomatic security services, right? So you have different agencies. However, when you have a structure like a director, deputy secretaries, and then, lower ranks, you're going to have different perspectives within each agency that is not going to align with one another, but the overall goal is the same. You go to another agency that handles national security matters. However, they have a slightly different structure, slightly different culture. They're not going to be as amicable because they see a competing agency. Who wants to get that bigger budget at the end of the year when they go before the Senate Appropriations Committee, right? They go like the fiscal year of 2002 or 2003 or the latest 2024. Each agency is always asking for more and more and more. We need more manpower. We need more desks. We need more of this, and we need a bigger budget. Like a bunch of whores going before the Senate. You know, we need this and that. And so a certain agency is going to get more than the other. And how do you do that? By having failures. Well, 9/11 would have happened if we had necessary manpower. That's what the CIA did. That's what the FBI did. That's what the NSA did. And guess what? After 9/11, we gave a blank check to these agencies, and they grew enormously. You thought they were big then. They're even bigger now. And why didn't they deserve that? Well, one, they lied. They had information that could have stopped 9/11 from their own whistleblowers, people like Thomas Drake of the NSA, Kirk Wiebe of the NSA, Mark Rossini, Doug Miller, Cam Williams, Colleen Rowley, Robert Wright Jr., all from the FBI, John Kiriakou, CIA. So you have people within these agencies that basically said, hey, we had enough manpower. We had a ton of information. We just didn't share it with one another. So there's your culture war. And after 9/11, the culture war ended when they broke the walls down for each agency. Now, each agency can work with one another and share information with one another regards to what? Surveilling the United States citizenry. Because that's what this was partly about. Letting 9/11 happen. Circumventing the Geneva Convention. Circumventing the Bill of Rights. Circumventing the Constitution. And your privacy. Internet law. Okay? All these were abused by the intelligence services because the ultimate goal of the federal government is to know what you're doing, to see what you're doing, the means of what you do it, and how you do it. And now it's even worse because they want to do it. They want to know what you're doing it, how you're thinking before you're doing it. Like Crime Stop, a form of Crime Stop that Orwell wrote about in 1984. It's why this is an impossibility, and this opens the floodgates, or a vacuum, if you will, for a more dangerous future, where the intelligence services are basically just one unit. There is no more CIA. There's no more NSA. There's no more FBI. We can't trust these agencies anymore. But the laws and the rules that they circumvented are in place already. And whatever comes and replaces these agencies are going to be more powerful than any agency we've ever seen before.
An easy thing to talk about, a hard thing to do. What do you think about? I mean, how do you think this should be made to happen, Secretary Wolfowitz?
Let me try to split in two different problems. I think, first of all, there is, before you get into the culture problem, there's just simple problems of compartmentation. One reason that the Rumsfeld Commission was able to break down a lot of stovepipes is that we had the authority to go into every compartment, and we could see that information in one compartment was something that people in another compartment needed to have and weren't getting.
That's what I was talking about.
That's not a culture issue. That is somebody with the oversight, the ability, and the time to look into those compartments that can break them down. You raise a bigger question, which is culture. You don't change those things overnight, nor do you want to change them entirely. I mean, you need organizations with specialized capabilities. I think, though, we've seen a lot over just the last 12 months of agencies, including agencies that are not traditionally worked together. The FBI, for example, has brought CIA analysts into the FBI. That's a rather radical change. How much it's changing the FBI, you'd have to ask the FBI director or the CIA
Let me
director.
use that statement to go into my final question. Regarding the FBI, from my point of view, I really question, I'd like both of your response on this, whether the FBI ought to be heavily involved in the intelligence business. They're trained differently, their skill sets are totally different, their habits are different, everything is different about them. They do a superb job at prosecuting, putting people in jail, finding this, but the intelligence thing on a domestic basis, which raises, serious questions of what would an alternative be, which is what we need to discuss, is something that I worry about a lot. You indicated the FBI reported to you, but was the FBI really monitoring some of these domestic groups in a way which was satisfactory to you? Did they have the mindset, skill set to do that?
I'm going to give you two answers. One is a prospective senator. I was involved in the setting up of the CTC in the mid-'80s, and there's been a light years difference between the FBI now and the FBI then. But the direct answer to your question is absolutely. The FBI must be more than an investigation and prosecutorial arm who comes in after an event. They have to be involved in the investigation and the monitoring. There's no way around it, nor should there be.
My time is up. I thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Senator Rockefeller.
So, when we talk about specialized agencies that specify in certain areas their strength, their skill sets, and you have different points of view regarding the leadership of these agencies. And when it comes to 9/11, basically, every agency failed us, some more than others. For example, the NSA. The NSA were listening to bin Laden's satellite phones and to a house in Yemen linked to an associate of bin Laden, which became an al-Qaeda communications hub. They didn't share any of those transcripts with anybody. What did they hear about on those phones? CIA. They do human intelligence as well as signals intelligence. They didn't share that information regarding the Yemen hub and two of the 9/11 hijackers who were living inside the United States with anybody, not even the NSA, who were hiding information from the CIA. The FBI, who had to play a role of flatfoot out of the three, basically had their foot soldiers work with the minuscule information that they had. And while they were investigating pole bombers, Millennium plotters, they were not just circumvented by the CIA and NSA, but by their own superiors in properly investigating these individuals who may have had some information relating to 9/11. Like Fahad al-Qusso, involved with the embassy bombings, who could have led them to Khalad. But the CIA and NSA knew about Khalad. They could have told that to the FBI, but nobody's talking. And one day, what's going to happen is you're going to have people basically agreeing that we don't need these agencies anymore. We need a new intelligence service. We need a new form of government. But that's not the problem. The problem is the system that is set up in place. And when you have the system set up in place that is totally in opposition to the civil liberty freedoms of everyday Americans, our way of life is going to be controlled by whatever comes next. Maybe that's why 9/11 attacks were allowed to happen in the first place. Just to throw it out there. All right, guys. Thank you very much for watching the video. I like doing the breakdown videos very much. It's always one of the best, my most entertaining to do regarding 9/11 is to try and fill in the blanks. And thank you very much, everybody. See you in the next video. Take care.